presenter today, Professor Zunes of USF. And I wanted to mention that he's an expert on foreign policy, especially the Middle East. He has written so many very insightful essays, and he's got a mailing list that you could subscribe to. I subscribe to it, and I read his articles. And I also want to mention that you can sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it and you want to be informed about these sessions. There's a clipboard by the door, and you can do that. So I believe I will now turn it over to Stephen Zunes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today I'd started preparing a couple of weeks ago a talk about how the Harris administration, would alter or maintain U.S. policy towards Israel-Palestine. I was actually fairly optimistic. I mean, because she was a sitting vice president, she couldn't openly break with the administration she was part of. It would have been seen as divisive, as disloyal. She was kind of stuck in a position like Hubert Humphrey was in 1968, who, despite his growing personal problems with the Johnson administration's policy in Vietnam, didn't feel he could really distance himself enough, and as a result, a lot of anti-war voters stayed home, and we ended up with Nixon. I had looked at her foreign policy team and others around her that, while most of them were not what you consider progressive, were a pragmatic internationalists, that had been on record speaking out against certain Israeli policies on a level far more than Biden, Blinken, people on the Biden's administration foreign policy team. I also, cited a whole number of news leaks, from via the Washington Post, Politico, and other DC publications that Harris had been one of the people on the inside of the administration who had unsuccessfully been pushing Biden to finally crack down on Netanyahu. But all that is for naught, obviously. I mean, I'm as shocked or surprised as many of you. And I realize that many of you are so worried about all the other things that are going to happen with the Trump presidency and a Republican-led Congress. It's hard to prioritize Israel-Palestine or even the greater Middle East North African region as a whole. I imagine we would have had a bigger audience today if Harris had won. This is still very important. And to remember that there are scores of civilians dying every day thanks to Washington's support for the far-right government in Israel and its ongoing war crimes, including violations of the genocide treaty. It can't be emphasized enough that Kamala Harris and every incumbent Democratic senator who lost and the Democratic Party platform were all on record of supporting unconditional military aid to a far-right government engaging in genocidal warfare, something which a sizable majority of Americans, including 80% of Democrats, oppose. I haven't looked in detail at the numbers and the exit polling data. I've been too depressed, frankly, but I don't doubt for a moment that the Biden administration's policies on Israel and its neighbors contributed substantially to Harris's loss. Now, again, I argued to give her some slack. I got in a lot of trouble with a lot of people by saying, it's important we give her the benefit of the doubt. It's critical we defeat Trump and all that. But one can understand why Arab Americans, why young people, why Muslims, why progressives, it made it impossible. I mean, the Biden administration's policies in the Middle East are remarkably similar to the Reagan administration's policies in Central America. I mean, just, supporting these incredibly repressive regimes that are killing tens of thousands of civilians, attacking the United Nations, the international judicial system, being an international outlier, even among our closest allies. I mean, this is really the U.S. policy really is quite extreme. But unfortunately, a lot of Democrats seem to believe that killing Palestinian Lebanese civilians and guaranteeing the profits of American arms exporters are more important than saving us from reactionary Republicans. It's a very different political climate than it was in even in recent years. That supporting the Israeli government, hurts rather than helps a candidate's chances of winning outside of maybe a handful of House districts. Um, yeah, but these people have either not gotten the memo about this really seismic shift in the American electorate, or they just didn't care. And let's remember, as with Central America and Vietnam and Iraq, the administration and Congress have been, telling us lies. That you remember Biden said that he had seen photographic evidence of Hamas beheading babies on October 7th. Well, Hamas did commit a whole bunch of other atrocities, but um, there's no evidence they actually beheaded children at all. And Biden, was lying. They admitted he didn't actually have these photographs. Claims that the Al Shifa Hospital and other medical facilities had Hamas operational headquarters underneath. The Washington Post and others have examined this in detail. Again, no evidence whatsoever. Claiming that the high death toll was because Hamas was using human shields. And, Hamas military operations have been closer than they should to where civilians were. Not surprising given how crowded the Hamas is, but the Gaza Strip is. But Amnesty International, others have looked, have not found any documented cases of Hamas, using human shields by the international legal definition. Again, other fault them for a lot of other things, but not that one. And meanwhile, there is evidence that Israel's been using human shields fairly often, but the administration has refused to, and Congress has refused to acknowledge that. Biden lied, saying that Israel's accepted the ceasefire when they have not. Biden's lied when he said the war would be over if Hamas released the hostages. The Israeli government has been very clear about that. The Biden administration has lied when they say they have no evidence that Israel's violating international humanitarian law, when there's extraordinary uh, clear evidence of that. And, lots of people simply could not vote for someone from an administration that not only supports war crimes, enables war crimes, providing the weapons for war crimes, including genocide, but repeatedly lies in order to justify it. And, as with Central America, as with Vietnam, as with Iraq, the United States is an international outlier. I mean, under the Biden administration vetoed a series of otherwise unanimous United Nations Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire. We are one of only 9 or 10 countries in the UN General Assembly, the only others being those under far-right governments or dependent Pacific Island states that voted against very mildly worded resolutions calling for a ceasefire. We are only 6 countries that voted against the call for establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. The United States is currently, I believe, the only country that has uh, cut off funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Administration, UNRWA, which provides important humanitarian aid. Several countries suspended aid temporarily when there were charges that 14 out of the 35,000 people who are on the UNRWA staff engaged in the October 7th attacks. But once they found that either the charges were not true or that UNRWA had fired and had nothing to do with these people, they restored funding. But the Biden administration and Congress have cut off all such funding despite its desperate needs. We've seen the Biden administration attack the International Criminal Court for a unanimous recommendation, by a high-profile panel of some of the leading jurists and human rights lawyers in the world, most of them British. And I mean, and these, it's amazing to see Biden. I mean, he literally finished in the bottom 10th of his law school class at Syracuse, and here he is, claiming that these outstanding jurists who've played major roles in other war crimes tribunals regarding former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Darfur, you know, Rohingya and Myanmar, I mean, et cetera, claiming that they don't know what they're talking about. And the United States is virtually the only country to argue before the International Court of Justice that Israel should have every right to hang on to the West Bank. And of course, the United States is the only country in the world that has formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved our embassy there, and the only country that's recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan region in southwestern Syria. And yeah, and this, and remember, this is the more moderate of the two political parties in the United States. And again, I don't think Harris would have been as hardline, but this is the administration that she was part of. And and of course the slaughter in Gaza and now in Lebanon is what's been in the news the most, of course. And you hear some reports of the supposed hand wringing. Oh, we were doing our best, and we heard the Democratic convention. Harris and Biden are working day and night to get a ceasefire. That is a lie. Other presidents have stopped Israel in their tracks when they have gone too far by threatening to withhold aid. We see Eisenhower following the Suez Crisis, 1956-57. Nixon pushing for a ceasefire in the 1973 war. Carter in the first invasion of Lebanon, Israel's first invasion of Lebanon in 1978. The senior Bush administration temporarily getting a settlement freeze. The Obama and the Iran nuclear deal. Even Reagan and the 1982-83 invasion and occupation of Lebanon twice. Initially to stop the siege of Beirut and later to get Israel to withdraw. Reagan threatened to withhold military aid, and he succeeded. So it's not like the Biden administration couldn't have done anything. They chose not to. And this is why, again, so many people refuse to support Harris. Now, having said all this, I think it's important to recognize that Trump is going to be even worse than Biden. And let's just look back at his first term. He helped create the conditions that led to the October 7th terrorist attack and everything that Israel's done since then. And he did this by pushing the so-called Abraham Accords that his son-in-law put together, which was to put strong incentives to get these various Arab dictatorships to recognize Israel prior to Israel recognizing an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel. Every Arab country since 2002 has been on record saying they would recognize Israel, have normal relations, have strict security guarantees in return for the end of the Israeli occupation. But what the Trump administration wanted to do was to eliminate this one bit of diplomatic leverage that the Palestinians had, and by pushing the normalization, prior to any change in Israel's policy towards the Palestinians. It was Trump that moved the capital to Jerusalem and moved the embassy there. It was Trump who closed down the U.S. consulate in Arab East Jerusalem, the occupied part of Jerusalem that had been there since the 1930s. These moves led to a rupture of diplomacy between the Palestinians and the United States, and confirmed the Palestinians there was no diplomatic path towards their freedom. I mean, when the U.S. Embassy officially opened Jerusalem, Trump and the Israeli leaderships were celebrating, while at the very same time, Israeli troops were gunning down unarmed Palestinian civilians gathering at the Gaza separation barrier during the Great March of Return. It was, Trump that recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan, and recognize that Israel's illegal settlements in the West Bank as part of Israel, insisting despite what the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, virtually the entire international community, the broad consensus of international scholars recognize, that no country can colonize territories under foreign belligerent occupation. This is clear in the Fourth Geneva Convention, no less than 5 UN Security Council resolutions that were supported by various U.S. administrations. This is a violation of rulings by the International Court of Justice, the broad consensus of international legal scholars. Basically, Trump, said it was okay to do this. This would be the equivalent of supporting, British colonization of Rhodesia or French colonization of Algeria. This is a very serious violation of international legal norms. And he, his administration redefined anti-Semitism, to basically saying anti-Zionism or even certain criticisms of the Israeli government are violations of U.S. civil rights statutes, and to make it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy. And what do we expect in the next term? I think more of the same. Just a week or so ago, Netanyahu's war crimes, Trump said, Bibi's doing a good job, and Biden is trying to hold him back. He should probably be doing the opposite, actually. In other words,
looking for white socks.
Can someone's talking? Can someone mute that so I could continue? Okay. Anyway, Trump says Bibi's doing a good job. Biden is trying to hold him back. He should probably be doing the opposite, actually. In other words, Trump saying there should be no limits, no constraints whatsoever. In a phone call to Netanyahu, Trump especially said, "Do what you need to do." In other words, he's saying the problem isn't genocide. The genocide is going too slowly. And he says, I'm glad that Netanyahu decides to do what he had to do, but it's moving along pretty good. And earlier this year, Trump called on Israel to finish the job, meaning, escalating the mass slaughter that was already going on. And in light of these kind of statements, it's hard to imagine that Trump, would even consider putting the kind of pressure on Netanyahu that has proven to be required to alter his policy, and that is stopping the flow of arms, to Israel. And Kushner, who again he's going to probably put in charge of Middle East policy, has talked about how the Gaza Strip has valuable waterfront property that the Israelis should take over. Indeed, the systematic physical destruction of much of northern Gaza. These are not just from the bombing and missiles. These are controlled demolitions, which have destroyed all 12 universities in the Gaza Strip, and the libraries and the municipal buildings and the records office. Every part of civic life they've systematically been destroying. And they literally are talking about bulldozing it over and opening it to Israeli settlements. Trump administration is likely to recognize the annexation of the West Bank, and lift the sanctions that Biden has put on these far right-wing settlers and their militia that have been, these are death squads basically, that have been have murdered hundreds of Palestinian civilians in the West Bank in recent years, that have burned olive groves and vineyards and destroyed, driven, thousands of people from their homes. The settlers will have free reign under a Trump administration. Meanwhile, Trump has promised to ban Palestinian refugees from the United States. Biden's policies, I think, was just based on the old "let's support our ally no matter what," kind of policies we've seen under both Republican and Democratic administrations. I remember this is not the first genocide the U.S. is supporting. The U.S. Supported Pakistan's genocide of Bangladesh in the early 70s. 24 years of genocide in East Timor by Indonesia, the early 90s Turkey's genocide in the Kurdish region of that country, the Guatemalan junta's genocide in the highlands against the indigenous peoples. I mean, you know, in certain ways, this is unfortunately is not a major departure from U.S. Policy under both Democratic and Republican administrations. But I mean, Trump explicitly hates Palestinians. I mean, he's used the word Palestinian as a pejorative, smear and insult. He's even referred to pro-Israel Democratic leaders as Palestinian, simply for opposing Netanyahu. One of the biggest concerns I have coming up in the next 4 years is suppressing dissent here at home. I mean, it's always already seen how there's been an unprecedented amount of state violence and suppression of academic freedom at American colleges and universities. But Trump has talked about using the National Guard or even the U.S. Army against protesters. Thus the ability of activists to impact policy would be even more limited. Trump's even talked about deporting all non-citizens if they are pro-Hamas. But let's recall that both Trump and bipartisan leaders in Congress have considered anybody protesting the genocide in Gaza to be pro-Hamas. With the majority in both houses of Congress, there is open talk of threatening university funding for any college or university that allows pro-Palestinian protests. They're basically redefining anti-Semitism so that engaging in protests against the Israeli occupation or against the Gaza war would be considered a violation of Chapter 6 of the Civil Rights Act, that a university or college is allowing for anti-Semitic activity to take place. I mean, it'd be comparable if a university wasn't cracking down on systemic date rape and other sexual harassment, or if they're allowing, racists to hang nooses and threaten black students. It would be under the same kind of protesting for Palestinian rights would be under the same kind of categories that would require colleges and universities to crack down or else lose federal funding or denying students access to Pell Grants or whatever. And he's remember he is called even moderate opponents of Netanyahu's policies as not just supporters of Hamas but members of Hamas. Now, right now, there's a bill in Congress, and which will, if it doesn't pass this session, and it does have some Democratic support, but it will almost certainly pass in the new Congress. The Trump administration could designate any nonprofit as a terrorist supporting organization. Once notified, an organization, could appeal within 90 days, but if their appeal is rejected, it would be stripped of its 501c3 status. And the law would not require officials to explain the reasons for designating a group as a terrorist supporting organization, nor does it require the Treasury Department to provide evidence. It basically empowers the Trump administration to target any group it wants to call them terrorist supporter and block their ability to be a nonprofit. So it basically kill any nonprofit's ability to function. They can't get banks to service them. They won't be able to get donations, and there'd be a black mark on the organization even if they cleared its name. The bill would also imperil the life-saving work of NGOs operating in war zones and other hostile areas where providing aid requires coordination with groups designated as terrorist by the U.S. So the parts of Lebanon where Hezbollah is effectively in charge, or Gaza, where Hamas is in charge, they would even just doing basic logistical coordination to get food or medical aid that could imperil their aid. So we're talking about the Red Cross, the World Kitchen. I mean, they will. I mean, there's already a prohibition on material support for foreign terrorist organizations. And so this is not the issue. What this is designed to is um, to stop, to limit, not only limit aid, but any kind of advocacy. I mean, even pacifist groups like the American Friends Service Committee or the Fellowship for Reconciliation or the Resource Center for Nonviolence down in Santa Cruz. I mean, these are groups that have been critical of the Israeli occupation, and they have been labeled pro-Hamas, by right-wing supporters of Israel. And these are the groups that could lose their nonprofit status under a Trump administration. This is not just speculation. Right-wing individuals who've made such charges against these groups are being considered for top positions in the Trump administration. And another concern I want to address here is that this is not, oh, let's hunker down for the next 4 years and then a Democratic administration will come in and reverse the damage. But, while by allowing and encouraging the additional Israeli settlements, for example, it'd be much harder for the Democratic administration saying, no, you have to withdraw from all these settlements now. No Democratic administration has ever, Democratic administrations have opposed the expansion of settlements, but none of them have said you have to leave. You got to give these up. These are illegal. And when you look about what the things that Trump did in his first session, Biden didn't reverse most of them. He refused to return the U.S. embassy to Tel Aviv. Indeed, Biden himself, as a senator, was the co-sponsor of the resolution that gave Trump the authority to move the embassy. Biden refused to reopen the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. He refused to reopen the PLO office in Washington. He refused to reverse the recognition of Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. And of course, this is something that Russia used in Security Council debates about the invasion of Ukraine, when the U.S., when the Biden administration was saying no country can unilaterally change international boundaries, no country can expand its territory by force, we need to enforce a rule-based international legal order. The Russian ambassador said, hey, you recognized Golan, which Israel seized by force in 1967. How can you say that you really care about these things? You're just unfairly singling out Russia for geopolitical reasons. And the Biden administration endorsed Kushner's Abraham Accords. It's praised in the 2024 Democratic platform, and Democratic congressional leaders have all came out and supporting it. And this is despite that, close to 85% of Middle East scholars surveyed said it actually harms the chances of Middle East peace. I think only 6% of U.S. Middle East scholars thought it advanced peace, but advanced prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace. But the Biden administration said, "Hey, yay, Jared Kushner. He knows more than Middle East scholars do. Let's do this." And one of the most worst aspects of the so-called Abraham Accords is recognizing Morocco's illegal annexation of the nation of Western Sahara, which is also a recognized territory under foreign belligerent occupation that the UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, International Court of Justice says deserves the right of self-determination. It's been recognized as an occupied territory. And this is done in return for Morocco recognizing Israel. This is part of the Abraham Accords. Now, this is noteworthy because remember, the Biden administration, some Democrats have claimed that they would actually support Palestinian statehood if only all the Palestinian factions recognized Israel, all the PLO and the Fatah and the Palestine Authority already have, but if you got all the others, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, whatever, to recognize Israel, to renounce terrorism, if the PA and others are more democratic, the U.S. might end up supporting Palestinian statehood alongside Israel. But if you look at Western Sahara, the Polisario Front, which is the recognized government of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which is a full member of the African Union, been recognized by over 80 countries, they've never questioned Morocco's right to exist. They've never engaged in terrorism. They have democratic elections for both their parliament and their president. So basically, what the Biden administration is saying here is that Trump is right that even though the Polisario have been doing everything right, our ally has a right to invade them, occupy them, colonize, take it over. And it also basically tells the Palestinians that even if they did get their act together and were moderate and renounced terrorism and democratic, the U.S. would support the occupation, annexation of their land anyway. Um, Let me, briefly review other aspects of U.S. Middle East policy. You know, his unilateral abrogation of the Iran nuclear deal, which even his own cabinet members affirmed was working, had stopped nuclear escalation, reduced regional tensions, and Trump reversed that. Biden refused to renew it. Um, and he gave a green light to Saudi Arabia's blockade of Qatar, which created all sorts of terrible tension within the region. Um, he's called on Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facility, and he said, "We'll just worry about the rest later." Um, and again, the recognition of Morocco's annexation of Western Sahara, his even closer relations with various dictatorial regimes. We're going to see his support for Turkey and their military role, suppressing the Kurds and not just within Turkey, but in northern Syria as well. I mean, this is we're going to see escalating tensions and possible war, regional war. The one positive thing I can say, and I always like to end these depressing talks on a more positive note, is that with Trump in charge, we might be able to get more allies within the Democratic Party. I mean, ever since Israel launched its war in response to October 7th last year, almost any criticism of Biden's policy was met by saying, "Oh, don't criticize him. It's only going to help Trump." There are a lot of people who will, just partisan Democrats, even fairly liberal ones, who will defend or at least keep quiet about democratic policies that are contrary to the vast majority of public opinion and certainly contrary to standards of human rights and international law. But with Trump doing these things, it might become easier for Democrats to object. And if they don't, we can say, "Hey, you guys are supporting Trump against what polls show are the overwhelming majority of registered Democrats." We can truthfully say these are pro-Trump Democrats, and because if you support unconditional military aid, you are pro-Trump. And if a liberal political action committee, considers endorsing a senator or a House member who sides with Trump against the majority of Democrats, protests say you are backing Trump supporting Democrats over real Democrats. And anyway, in short, basically what I'm encouraging people to do is let's avoid divisive debates about the nature of Zionism, one state versus two state, the competing historical narratives, and just talk about basic human rights. Talk about the basic principles, that have we talked about before, and I realize a number of people in this audience are old enough to remember the struggles we did have around, say, Central America, apartheid South Africa, East Timor, other issues that we have changed U.S. policies, and we can change U.S. policy again, but we need to make it a priority, and we will not be able to change Trump's policies if we can't even get the majority of Democrats on our side. So I think that's really where we need to focus is to stop supporting Democrats who side with Trump against the majority of registered Democratic voters. Target them, shame them, sit in their offices, do whatever it takes to get them to shift. Because that's the only way we're going to really create a difference. And as I say, I think with Trump and the Republicans in charge and not even pretending to support a ceasefire, not even pretending to support a two-state solution, I think we can really can provide the political opening for successful mobilization. So let me stop there and can open it up to any questions.
We have a lot of great questions for you, Professor Zunes. In no particular order, Slavoj Zizek, a philosopher I have not heard of, wrote an insightful article that the U.S. should militarily enter Israel, Palestine, and enforce peace. Do you agree? And I could add to that we already have. Didn't they land some troops as a part of sending these missiles over there to Israel
And not
to help
to
them?
enforce peace, but to staff these sophisticated anti-missile defense systems, basically saying to Israel, you can escalate things with Iran or whatever as much as you want, and you won't have to suffer the consequences because we'll help defend you from any Iranian response. I think what Zizek is talking about is something along the lines of that that let's say the UN Security Council, passes a resolution calling for a two-state solution along the lines of the 2003 Geneva Initiative or even the January 2001 Taba talks or things like that, and basically say if both sides have to agree to it, and if you don't agree, we'll put on sanctions and we'll bring in UN peacekeeping forces, or we'll bring in UN peacekeeping forces in any case. But I wouldn't support unilateral U.S. troops, but I think using the power of the UN, to enforce its resolutions does seem quite reasonable. Of course, the U.S. would veto it, never allow it to happen, even under a Democratic administration.
And of course, we know how opposed to the UN Israel is. They're attacking their forces in Lebanon, and they've banned UNRWA and so forth. Next question is, when will the 10,000 prisoners in Israel? I read yesterday that there have been 9,000 prisoners taken just since October 7th of last year. So that doesn't perhaps include the number that preceded October 7th. When will those prisoners in Israeli prisons under administrative detention be freed?
Well, people that are being held without charge for indefinite periods are hostages, essentially. But given the racist nature of the Biden administration and many people in Washington and Trump people, of course, these aren't the hostages. Only Israelis held by Hamas are hostages. Part of Hamas's demands in the negotiation for ceasefire is that these prisoners have to be released along with the hostages. And some of them have indeed engaged in armed resistance. Some of them engaged in terrorism. But the vast majority, as far as I can tell, were those who were involved in various forms of nonviolent resistance, like in various villages where the settlers were trying to seize their land. And I don't know if anybody's seen the film Five Broken Cameras about Eyal Burnett and his family. His sons have been in detention for many months now for purely nonviolent resistance. So that that is continuing, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Please describe the role of Iran relative to Arab countries and their support on Gaza, Lebanon, and the Palestinian statehood.
Well, Iran is a reactionary regime that has its own imperialist ambitions in the region. They have these proxy militia in Iraq and Syria that are beholden to elements of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They've also been major supporters of various popular movements also relatively pretty reactionary, but do have a social base, such as the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Iran. Their connection to Hamas has been grossly exaggerated. Um, they are not an Iranian proxy. Their ideology, their history is very, very different. Um, Hamas is more closely affiliated to the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, for example, which has a very different ideology and differences with Iran. And for example, during the Syrian civil war, Hamas and um, uh, the uh, Iranian regime were on opposite sides, supporting opposite sides. Um, Islamic Jihad is the favored faction, Palestinian faction that Iran supports, not Hamas. And they've gotten some limited funding, some smaller rockets, but nothing compared to the support they've given the Houthis or Hezbollah or their proxies in um, Iraq and Syria. I think there's this tendency to just as every leftist movement in the global South used to be labeled a Soviet proxy or whatever during the Cold War. There's a tendency to do this with opposition movements in the Middle East, even nonviolent pro-democracy movements like in Bahrain. They were brutally crushed by the U.S.-backed Bahraini regime, and you had U.S. officials, claiming they were, some part of an Iranian plot to seize that Persian Gulf island nation. So we've seen this before. Denying agency, to the groups. Again, Hamas is a horrific reactionary group engaged in terrorism, and I'm not no fan of them either. But they're not Iranian proxies.
Do you think that to the extent that those Arab countries you mentioned and Iran share a concern for Palestine could overcome their mutual animosity and rivalry, given just the extreme level that the genocide has received, it has gotten to?
Frankly, I think Iran, like the Arab governments, have used the Palestinians as political pawns to advance their agenda. And the popular sentiment in both Iran and the Arab world is very strongly in support of the Palestinians. But I don't trust the governments to cooperate much. They're jockeying for position. Indeed, I think the reason that Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis have taken on such a leading role is to advance their support in the region. They can say, look, the United States in particular, but the West in general, has been supporting Israel. The Arab governments, despite some hand-wringing, haven't done anything about it. We're the only ones who are standing up for them, and it's a way of gaining support. And when the U.S. takes a position that, oh, we get to bomb Yemen, Israel gets to bomb Yemen. In fact, U.S. actually sent in B-2 bombers. I mean, we're not just talking about the sea-launched missiles, cruise missiles. We're talking about heavy bombers. We're justifying all this intervention to protect Israel from the supposed unprovoked attacks. But the Houthis and the Hezbollah have been very clear they would stop as soon as Israel stopped bombing Gaza. So if the U.S. was concerned about shipping in the Red Sea, if the U.S. was concerned about Hezbollah lobbing rockets into northern Israel, they would simply get Israel to stop the war on Gaza instead of facilitating the mass killing of Lebanese and Yemeni civilians.
Next question, Professor Zunes. Last week, Vladimir Putin called for Israel to recognize Palestinian rights and equality, suggests a defunct state solution. Oh, he's suggesting the two-state solution, I believe. Yeah. Considering Trump's pride in his relationship with Vladimir Putin and good relations with him, could this make a difference in our separation from Israel?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that Russia, feels the need to say that because they're trying to extend their influence in much of the global South through BRICS and through other things. So, I think they would feel obliged to say that kind of thing. Obviously, Russia doesn't have much ground to stand on in terms of opposing occupations and expanding territory by force and that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, I don't, and so again, I don't think there's much really much to it other than just jockeying for more credibility in the international community that Washington has lost as a result of its support for Israel.
Okay. Going to consolidate two questions here. One has to do with the protest movement in Israel, which I've seen a fair amount of in the news. The comment was that we don't hear much about it. My own understanding of it is that they are not protesting against the genocide. They're really clamoring for a return to the Zionist status quo. So what is your
Yeah, I
take
mean,
on the
look at
protest?
this.
Let me add more, a little more to the question. And then the second question is talk about Israeli youth, young adults, and their support for Netanyahu and the IDF. What is their view on Palestinian prisoners and what's going on in Gaza?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, I mean, yeah, it's true that the much of the protests, have been around Netanyahu's refusal to make a deal that would lead to the release of the remaining hostages, and the fact that Israeli soldiers are continuing to die and fighting in Gaza. Um, so yeah, they are, yes, more concerned about Israelis than are Palestinians. But let's remember, for those of us who are old enough to remember the anti-Vietnam War movement, most people who opposed the Vietnam War were not because we were killing millions of Vietnamese through carpet bombing the cities, free fire zones, and the NLF held areas of South Vietnam, the defoliants, all the other horrible things we were doing, but because Americans were coming home in body bags, and people didn't want to be drafted and sent over there. But the time we figured, hey, we'll get it, whatever help we can get. We don't you don't have to you know you don't have to take a more consistent, overall progressive pro-peace position. And I think that's how we should look at the protest in Israel. That many people out there in the streets are somewhat limited in their demands, but at least unlike Biden and unlike Trump, they are opposing Netanyahu and his policies.
Okay, I'm going to consolidate three more questions relating to Iran, BRICS, which is this new consortium of countries that's positioning itself as a alternative to NATO, and yeah, and also Trump's supposed anti-interventionist intentions. So, with the shift from diplomacy to negotiation towards violence and militarism, international affairs, should we expect that Iran will now develop nuclear weapons and abandon its position of not doing that? Then comment on the significance of BRICS. Maybe you should explain what BRICS is, just in case anyone doesn't know about that. And then Trump says he'll end all wars. What does he really mean?
Okay, if I don't answer all these, remind me to follow up. I mean, I think during his first term, Trump seemed genuinely reluctant to put American lives at risk in challenging Iran. In fact, there are a couple lines in the Democratic platform this year that actually criticized Trump for not being tougher on Iran and not responding militarily to various Iranian provocations. Um, but I think Trump would be quite willing to give Israel a blank check, and to use Israel as a surrogate. Um, and but the United States, I mean the Iranians, recognizing that what Israel can do what it does because of U.S. support, may not make a distinction in how they respond. I think one of the major reasons that Biden really pressured Israel to not attack Iranian um, oil and nuclear facilities was that he was afraid that not only there with oil prices skyrocket, if the Persian Gulf became a battleground, but that these pro-Iranian militia could attack U.S. forces in these small isolated bases in Syria and in Iraq and in bordering areas of Jordan. and he didn't want to have American casualties. Um, so will Trump withdraw these small numbers of forces to make Americans less vulnerable, and then give Israel the blank check to do what it wants to do? Um, would he'd be okay about higher oil prices because it helps his buddies in the oil industry? I mean, it's hard to say. I think he is the crazy thing about Trump, and he did this in both in all three of his elections campaigns, is that he has tried to outflank the Democrats both on the left and the right. Tried to say that I'm so powerful and tough that no country's gonna mess with me because I'm going to bomb the hell out of them if they do. But on the other hand, accuse the Democrats, people like Biden and Hillary Clinton, who supported the Iraq War, that Trump says he opposed, even though he's actually on record having supported it. Saying I'll bring the troops home when, in fact, he's kind of just shifted them around away from protecting Kurds in northern Syria to protecting the oil fields. But all these ways he's tried to communicate, and then in fact, a major reason he's gotten, one of the areas I think a lot of the media is missing, is the reason he's gotten more working class support is that it's working class people whose kids are sent to places like the Middle East under Democratic administrations. And he keeps saying he's going to bring the troops home, America first. And again, he's lying. We're going to still have a huge military footprint over there. But that's the rhetoric he's used, and that's why I've argued that if we had a genuinely anti-war, anti-interventionist Democratic nominee, they'd actually do a lot better than the likes of Clinton and Biden, and by extension Harris.
Your comments about the expected crackdown on pro-Palestinian solidarity movements alarmed a lot of us in the room here, including me. And several people asked questions about this. One is, do churches, mosques, and synagogues fall under nonprofit status in any way? I believe they do. And can they lose their 501c3 status if they are engaged in Palestine advocacy? And a related question is, do you anticipate a mass movement of demonstrations and resistance? I remember how it went when Trump was elected the first time. There were a lot of protests, women's marches, and so forth. Can we expect that? And do you think people should be getting out and mobilizing in that way? Will it make a difference?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but my assumption is that churches have a little more protection, um, you know, um, under the First Amendment, in terms of their status. Though, again, if they there could be some pressure, to be sure, and warnings, and possible court battles. Um, and given the nature of the people that Trump has appointed already and will be appointing to these courts, even if we again have a Democratic administration 4 years from now, even a progressive one, that the courts will uphold certainly state laws that punish those who are critical of Israel. I'm just give one personal example. I've been invited to give a talk at Georgia Southern University, which is a public institution. But in order to get reimbursed for my airfare and lodging and to get an honorarium, I have to sign a statement that says I do not boycott Israel. And what's striking about this is that they define Israel as Israel or territories controlled by Israel, which means that I don't personally boycott Israel as a whole, but I do boycott the Israeli settlements, for example, or certain corporations that directly support the Israeli occupation settlements. But according to the Georgia law and the law of over 26 states, that is boycotting Israel, and therefore I can't receive an honorarium or other kinds of support. And this is a way that we've been seeing many states essentially make it very difficult for speakers and artists and others to come to state universities now, because presumably the people who would sign that statement are those who are on the right, and those who feel like they couldn't would be on the left. So we're already seeing the impact of this kind of crackdown. Now I've lost track of the original question. I'm sorry.
I think that covered it pretty well.
Okay.
Okay, now we have a couple relating to Joe Biden. He is on record saying that if Israel did not exist, we would need to invent it.
Mhm.
If it wasn't already there. Does understanding this help us realize why Netanyahu gets unconditional support?
Oh, very much so. Very much so.
And a related question, Professor Zunes, do you think that Biden has received the most money from the Israeli lobby, and that is a factor in his actions?
Yeah, the pro-Israel political action committees, can have some impact in some close House races. But given the cost of a presidential campaign, you know, it is so huge that even if all the AIPAC money went into Trump or whatever, it would not have really made even a dent in the overall campaign spending. I really don't think that it's a factor for Biden. There are two things around Biden. One is that he is of that immediate post-World War II generation that has this really idealistic view of Israel that assumes all criticism is based on anti-Semitism or something like that. He sees Israel as Paul Newman in Exodus. He sees Israel as this romanticized, social democracy in the reactionary Arab world, making the desert bloom, and all that kind of stuff that, those of you, who are, maybe 65 and older remember was the dominant narrative, for many, many years. I mean, so, people like him, liberals that have this idealistic view, they remind me of the old communists from the 1930s. They did great things on civil rights and labor and whatever, but they still believe, by golly, that Uncle Joe Stalin was the man and was doing the right thing, and all the reports of pogroms and gulags were just capitalist propaganda and not to believe. So I think he really is a true believer, first and foremost. But also, by what he says, that quote you gave, and similarly, a recent Secretary of State called Israel our unsinkable aircraft carrier, is that we're supporting Israel the same reason we supported other repressive right-wing regimes that violate international legal norms. They are seen as an ally. They keep leftist and Islamist movements in check, not just in Palestine, but in Lebanon, Jordan, elsewhere around the region. They provide battlefield testing for U.S. weapons. They've trained U.S. soldiers in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. The military-industrial complexes are closely intertwined in research and development, new jet fighters, anti-missile defense systems. They funneled U.S. arms to third parties we couldn't give to directly for political reasons. Back in the day, they included, the Nicaraguan Contras, the Guatemalan junta, apartheid South Africa, more recently, Colombian paramilitaries and certain Kurdish groups. This is our Arab allies could be overthrown, a coup or revolution, but Israel is there to stay. And so I really do think it is foremost a strategic issue, seeing it advances U.S. strategic interests. Now, there's certain neo-realists, who challenge that, who say it hurts U.S. interests in the long run in terms of getting the Arab and Islamic world against us and all that kind of thing, which I agree. I agree with that. But the dominant view in Washington at this point, especially among that older generation. And again, I think if Harris had won, I think she would have shifted away from this. Her advisors were a little younger and looked at the big picture more. But certainly under people like Biden and Trump, this is Israel is seen as a strategic asset. And again, this is not that different than other genocidal, repressive right-wing regimes we've looked at over history. I generally think talk about AIPAC and its power is exaggerated. It doesn't mean they don't have an impact. I mean, I've had talks canceled. I've been blacklisted. I've been, called all sorts of names, and things like that. But and if it weren't for AIPAC, there'd be less censorship. We'd have more allies among liberal Democrats in Congress. there would be a bigger movement. That it has stifled debate. They have stifled debate to some degree. But my point is that the power of AIPAC is that it's made it more difficult to challenge U.S. policy. But U.S. policy, frankly, would be more or less the same even without AIPAC. I mean, this idea that, oh, if it weren't for AIPAC, we'd be concerned about human rights and international law and force our allies to abide by international legal norms. I mean, when have we done that anywhere? I mean, seriously, you know, not just the Middle East, but South and Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa. I mean, come on. The problem is U.S. militarism and imperialism, or some people would argue, patriarchy, late stage capitalism. I mean, whatever is the structural issues. And I think it's dangerous to put too much emphasis on AIPAC because, frankly, that sounds a little like, oh, they can't help it. There's this cabal of Jews behind the scenes that are actually controlling things. Kind of dovetails these anti-Semitic stereotypes. Now, I'm not saying that it's anti-Semitic to criticize AIPAC. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of good reason to criticize them, but I just don't think they are the reason and the main motivation for U.S. policy.
They did force out two of the most prominent pro-Palestine Congress people, but I think your point is that imperialism is driving
others who are less vulnerable for other reasons were able to beat them off. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now we have a couple of comments relating to Bernie Sanders. He had a clearer message to Trump supporters that would have changed if he were running, I think is how I could put this. Might he have won? And I'd like to add to that, what did you think of Kamala Harris cozying up to Liz Cheney and other quote unquote moderate Republicans as a strategy in this election? And do you think that affected the outcome?
Oh, there's no question that if Bernie had been the nominee in 2016 rather than Hillary Clinton, he would have defeated Trump. Polls before, during, and after the campaign were very clear that much of the pro-Trump debate is an anti-establishment vote, and Bernie's anti-establishment. He opposed the Iraq War. He opposed neoliberal economic policies that have impacted the working class in ways that Trump was able to take advantage of. We see this phenomenon of people going for the anti-establishment. Like again in Wisconsin, we saw a lot of people who voted for Bernie in the primaries vote for Trump in the general election. In fact, I remember back in '68, there were a lot of working class people I noticed and who voted for Gene McCarthy in the Democratic primary, then voted for George Wallace in the general election. So this is a phenomenon we've seen before. When you're dealing with a right-wing put it this way. If there's a mainstream conservative Republican nominee, say a Bob Dole, there is there's something to say for triangulation of a moving to the center. But if you're dealing with a right-wing populist, the only real antidote to that is left-wing populism. If you move to the center, you are even more part of the establishment. So you get all these Republican intellectuals and others, endorsing Harris, but that just makes it feel like, oh, that's even more the establishment. And Trump is fighting the establishment of both parties. Yeah, he's the guy. He's against he's against the status quo of both ways. And so these defections of these Republicans. I mean, I was telling a friend the other day, it helped Harris get the Episcopalian vote, but not the broader, but Episcopalians or internationalist Republicans or more rational intellectual Republicans. They're pretty tiny. They're influential. You'll see them in the op-ed columns of the Washington Post and New York Times. You'll see them on these ads, but in terms of numerically, they're not that big, and so. This was a real big mistake, and also reinforced the left critique of Kamala Harris, saying she would not allow a single Palestinian American to speak at the convention, but she lets these right-wing, anti-choice, pro-war Republicans talk, and she buddy with Liz Cheney, the ultimate war hawk, but she doesn't want to be filmed with Arab Americans or or progressives or people like that. So kind of reinforce the more cynical left support. People who end up voting for Jill Stein or whatever. So that was a huge miscalculation there. That again, if you want to defeat right-wing populism, it has to be left-wing populism.
We're running low on time. There may not be time for every question, but we'll do a couple more. One is Gaza is in ruins. Yahya Sinwar, the October 7th mastermind, is dead. Netanyahu's ally Trump is the president-elect. Is it more likely that Gaza will surrender and release the hostages unconditionally sooner now that Trump is president-elect?
No, I really think it's the attitude, if anything, is the opposite. They feel they have nothing to lose at this point. Indeed, the Qataris have dropped out of the mediation process because not only Israel's continuing to be hardline, but it seems like Hamas has retrenched somewhat as well. So no, I don't.
Please explain the power of the weapons industry in the U.S. economy, government, and foreign policy.
No, it's huge. And it's why we have such a bloated military budget, far, 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 far in excess of any other advanced industrialized nation. In fact, Trump scored a lot of points by saying, quite reasonably, why should we be paying for the defense of Europe or Australia or East Asian countries that have a GNP comparable to ours? Let them pay for their own defense. Now, of course, Trump isn't going to reduce military spending. He may reduce support for NATO or may reduce support for certain mutual defense things, but he's going to let the military industrial complex have all they want. I mean, he's going to continue to just have incredibly wastefully high spending. But unfortunately, so would Harris in that regard. But they do have a big role. I mean that we talk about occasionally still things. Why are we giving all this aid to Israel? I mean, they have universal health care, they have affordable higher education, they have all these things we don't have, and yet we're giving them, $18 billion this past year alone. But something, over 90% of that $18 billion are arms manufacturers. The Israelis do not see that money, and it costs the Israelis additional money for personnel, training, and spare parts. So it's not like we are subsidizing the state of Israel. We are subsidizing the arms industry. And, they are as gung-ho about this war as they are about the these incredibly wasteful weapon systems that they managed to be able to push through Congress with bipartisan support that even the Pentagon says aren't necessary.
We don't usually lump the tech companies in with defense, but in fact, AI has been used a lot in this war. I personally have heard that Facebook, Meta, has been sharing the members of chat groups in WhatsApp with the IDF, and they use this to program the drones. And so they would, like, if they found a Hamas fighter, they use the phone, they get the chat, all the members of the chat group, they send the drone and it destroys the building that every one of these people are living in.
Yeah.
And that's how the casualties became so high. Part of the reason. Any comments about that before we have two more
there's some very interesting articles, analysis of this, and again, it's really scary. It looks at this, that we are escalating into a new form of warfare. I mean, civilian casualties had actually been declining in wars over the years because there are these smart bombs, more accurate systems, but they're starting to go up again as a result of these new technologies. And the exploding pagers and that kind of thing. I mean, that's a very, very dangerous precedent. I mean, what if other governments that don't like the United States get a hold of these and they start going after Americans? What if some criminal syndicate gets a hold of these and does extortion? I mean, this is we're in a dangerous new world here.
Okay, we'll wrap up with two questions on a more hopeful note, kind of how you think we can move forward. Mm-hmm. One is, more and more groups of Israeli and Palestinians are making the rounds, speaking of standing together, Parents Circle, and others. We had hosted them a meeting like that here about a month ago. Do you see hope there? And the other question is, what power does the anti-war movement globally have in the Israeli-Gaza, Lebanon war, and other wars?
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned also Sudan and Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do in Sudan. Unfortunately, the one thing is we could put some pressure on the United Arab Emirates, whom we have a lot of lucrative arms deals with because they seem to be supporting the RSF, which this genocidal faction that is responsible for this. But it's not nearly as direct a role as we see in Israel and its wars. Ukraine, I mean, we can certainly debate about whether the continuing to send military aid just drags on this indefinite war in the trenches that is just killing tens of thousands of conscripts on both sides. That threatening a wider war is the 18% of Ukraine that Russia currently legally occupies, worth that kind of cost. And one can certainly debate that, but I think most of the world does see we are, for once, we're actually supporting a democracy against a dictatorship that's engaging in a war of aggression. So I don't see much of a shift in terms of Western policy there, though the U.S. under Trump may withdraw support, and the Europeans will take on the burden. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to stop fighting. I mean, it's ultimately their decision. Sorry,
The other question was about Palestinians and Israelis kind of going on tour together.
I mean, I think that you've had these kind of dialogue groups for decades now, and they've been really important because they've let people hear each other's stories and understand their fears. I've spent time at Neva Shalom, Salam, this integrated Jewish Arab village in Israel. So I'm all for these kinds of things, but what a lot more and more Palestinians, even the most moderate Palestinians, are less and less reluctant to take part of with these because they are saying it shows this false sense of normalcy. It gives Israelis a chance to say, "Oh, aren't we nice? See, Palestinians and Arabs and Jews working together, this joint youth orchestra, this joint environmental project, this joint, dialogue, isn't this great?" And to them, it's like saying white and black South Africans have a dialogue group while apartheid is still in effect. That you have to address, listening to dialogue, hearing each other's stories, including history of oppression and, learning about the Holocaust. All these things are, again, good and important. But you need to address the gross asymmetry in power right now between the Israeli occupation and Palestinians under occupation. That is really what is critical. Now, some of these new groups, including the ones you mentioned, are starting to address this. They are saying yes, reconciliation, listening to each other, but they are acknowledging, what's happening on the ground and how that makes it difficult. And we can't really have peace unless these underlying issues are addressed. But I think the fundamental thing is that we do need to, focus on U.S. policy because, the U.S. has had this contradictory position of being the chief mediator of the conflict, insisting the United Nations can't play a role, opposing global civil society playing a role, like with the BDS campaign, and insisting that they will not condition military aid, and then say, but we are the mediators. Now, anybody who knows the first thing about conflict resolution and mediation knows that the mediator needs to be objective. You can't be a mediator of conflict and being the major military, financial, and diplomatic supporter of one of the two parties, the more powerful by far of the two parties. That is why there's no peace, because of this contradictory role. And so, that's why I think really we really need to stress how U.S. policy has not only been horrific for Palestinians and Lebanese, but ultimately doesn't make Israel more secure either. I mean, Israel will be far more secure within its internationally recognized borders and trying to defend a park archipelago of illegal settlements and military outposts amidst a hostile population. It was it was because of U.S. Biden support, because of U.S. support, Netanyahu could say, we can ignore the Palestinians. We got everything under control. That was just 2 months before October 7th. And the Palestinians said, no, you can't ignore us. Until you address the underlying oppression, the denial of self-determination, the apartheid system you've imposed, you will never be safe. And some people could argue, as one of the questions implied, that it's too late for a two-state solution. I've worked for a two-state solution for 40 years, and my past 2 trips to the West Bank, unfortunately, I'm coming to that conclusion myself. I think it's tactically, it's important to make a distinction between Israel within its internationally recognized border and the occupied territories. Legally, there's a very important distinction. But yeah, I'm getting less and less confident that due to the demographics and everything else, that a viable contiguous Palestinian state, could emerge, and we need to start thinking about some kind of confederation, binational state, whatever. But I don't think that should be where we put our attention on. We should put our attention on stopping the genocide, stopping and ending the occupation, colonization, and stopping U.S. support, for these things. Because as long as that goes on, there'll be no peace, there'll be no security for anybody.
Thank you so much for your insights. It's been a wonderful meeting, as always, to have you here. Okay, everyone, please come back next Sunday. We'll have more on Israel and Palestine. We'll have Veterans for Peace, and they'll be talking about the ecological impact of this war on the Middle East.
Well, briefly, I could just throw out 2 things. One, again, and people are willing, happy to add to my email list, where I send out my periodic articles, short articles, readable articles on U.S. Middle East policy. So please put them in the chat, or to give them in person to the folks in the church, and they'll forward it on to me. And the second thing, I just want to make an announcement that a week from tomorrow, at 4 p.m, the University of San Francisco is going to be hosting Professor Syed Atshan. He's a Palestinian who Harvard PhD, who is the director of the Peace and Conflict Studies program at Swarthmore College, the premier peace studies program in the country. And he is going to be giving a talk entitled Gaza, a Queer Feminist Perspective. And so I think this will give a different take, an important one, for those of us who are concerned about Israel and Palestine. Again, this is a week from Monday, the 18th, 4 o'clock, University of San Francisco.
That sounds very interesting. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next Sunday.